Have you ever had the impression that school slowly changes the way you learn? At the beginning, things might feel more natural, like curiosity, interest, even enjoyment. But over time, it can start to feel like something else takes over, working mainly for grades, avoiding mistakes, meeting expectations, and trying not to fall behind. And at some point, a question quietly appears underneath all of that. Is it possible to keep a real sense of interest and personal drive in an environment that is mostly built around pressure, evaluation, and results? Or does the system inevitably reshape the way we relate to learning itself? Well, that's what this video is all about. We're going to explore what actually drives human motivation in school, why it often shifts as we go throughout the education system, and how the structure of school influences the way we think, study, and engage with knowledge. And then we'll bring it back to something very concrete, what this means for real students in real classroom with real pressure. Before we start, I just want to say that I am not a neuroscientist nor a researcher, and I don't claim to have absolute answers. I'm simply deeply interested in understanding how the human mind works and committed to exploring these topics seriously and thoughtfully. And I put all research and statistics I mentioned on this video on the description box if you want to check them out. Everything here is in exploration, not a final truth. So with that in mind, let's get started. Welcome back to the Learning Lab. Students often describe school in a very specific way, even if they don't always use the same words. They study, complete tasks, revise, but the driving force behind all of it is rarely the same thing that originally makes learning feel natural. In many school contexts, the main reason for working is not the activity itself, but what comes after it: grades, ranking, future opportunities, approval, or avoiding failure. In psychology, this type of motivation is called extrinsic motivation. It refers to behavior driven by external outcomes rather than the inherent satisfaction of the activity. Within self-determination theory, developed by Deci and Ryan, motivation is generally described along a continuum. On one side, there is intrinsic motivation, doing something because it is interesting or satisfying in itself. On the other side, extrinsic motivation, doing something because it leads to an external result. In real education settings, motivation is almost never purely one or the other, but research in educational psychology suggests that structured systems like school tend to rely heavily on external forms of regulation, especially grades, evaluation, and comparison. Studies in academic motivation, including work by Leeper, Corpus, and Linger, have observed that as students progress through the schooling, motivation often becomes more performance-oriented. In other words, the focus shifts from understanding a subject to achieving a result in it. At the same time, it is important to be precise here. This does not mean intrinsic motivation disappears. Rather, it often becomes less visible and less expressed, or less central compared to performance-based goals. The key tension appears when we compare the function of extrinsic motivation and its effect on learning. Extrinsic motivation has a clear advantage: it provides structure. It supports discipline, consistency, and effort, even in tasks that are not immediately enjoyable. In that sense, it prepares individuals for real-life contexts where not everything is inherently motivating. However, research in self-determination theory also shows that the effect of external motivation depends strongly on how it is experienced. When external pressure is perceived as controlling, motivation tends to shift towards compliance rather than engagement. Learning becomes less about understanding and more about performance. And in many cases, this is associated with outcomes such as increased anxiety, perfectionism, and reduced curiosity. Deci, Kostner, and Ryan's meta-analysis on rewards and motivation also show something important. When rewards are experienced as controlling, they can reduce intrinsic interest in the task itself. This is where the tension becomes clear. The same external structure that creates discipline can, under certain conditions fulfilled by school, also reshape the relationship students have with learning itself. Now, evaluation plays a central role in this entire dynamic, but this is often misunderstood as a single concept. Evaluation is not inherently problematic. In fact, research in education, including work by Black and William on formative assessment, shows that evaluation can significantly improve learning, in fact, but only when it is used to guide progress rather than to rank individuals. The key distinction, though, is between two types of evaluations. One type is evaluation that supports learning. This form of evaluation is descriptive. It gives feedback, highlights progress, and helps the learner understand how to improve. The other type is evaluation that controls behavior. This form of evaluation is comparative or punitive. It focuses on ranking, pressure, or negative consequences and tends to orient students toward performance rather than actual understanding. From a motivational perspective, these two approaches do not have the same effect. Research associated with, again, self-determination theory and autonomy supportive teaching shows that controlling environments tend to reduce intrinsic motivation, while autonomy supportive and feedback-rich environments tend to preserve or even enhance it. So the problem is not evaluation itself, but the way evaluation is structurally used within the system. This leads to the central question. If external evaluation is unavoidable in most educational systems, then the challenge is not how to eliminate it, because our students will have much power over how the system works, but the question is rather how to preserve something more fragile within it. How can intrinsic motivation be maintained or rebuilt in environments that are structurally based on external pressure? Well, self-determination theory offers a direction rather than a single answer. It suggests that motivation becomes more internalized and intrinsic when three psychological needs are supported. The first one is autonomy. When learners feel they have some degree of choice, explanation, or ownership over what they are doing, motivation tends to become more self-directed. The second point is competence. When feedback helps someone understand an improvement rather than simply rank performance, engagement tends to increase. And the third and last point is relatedness. When learners feel respected, understood, and not reduced to simply performance alone, motivation is more likely to persist in a stable way. In this perspective, the goal is not to remove external structures entirely, but to reshape the way they interact with the learner's internal experience. Because even within systems dominated by external evaluation, motivation is not fixed. It can shift, weaken, or be rebuilt depending on how learning is experienced from the inside. So now, these three needs, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, can sound abstract, and they are when described as theory. But they are not meant to describe ideal conditions. They are meant to describe how motivation can be rebuilt even when conditions are not ideal. The key point is this: students do not need full control over the system in order to experience autonomy. They need small areas where choice and meaning can be reconstructed inside what already exists. Autonomy, in practice, does not mean choosing everything. It can mean when studying a required lesson, instead of only following the order imposed by the course, a student can decide how to approach it. For example, starting from the parts that feels most confusing instead of the easiest, or rewriting the lesson in their own structure instead of memorizing it as given. It can also mean adding a layer of personal intentions, not I'm doing this because I have to pass, like shoulding, but I am doing this because I want to understand this one idea properly, even if the system only asks me to memorize it. This, I do agree, are small shifts, but it changes the internal position from passive execution to partial ownership as much as the system allows us. Competence in practice is also not about external validation. It is about perception of progress. Most students only experience competence through grades, but grades are delayed, compressed, and often unclear in terms of what's actually improved. A more direct way to rebuild competence is to make progress visible in smaller units. For example, instead of studying an entire chapter as a single block, breaking it into sections and asking, what can I now explain that I could not explain 30 minutes ago? Or doing something simple like rewriting a concept in a simpler form as if teaching it to someone who knows nothing about it. The goal here is not perfection, but the experience of I can now do something that I could not do before. That feeling is not only enjoyable, but it is literally what sustains competence internally, and so your motivation, not only the grade itself. Relatedness is the most underestimated one in academic contexts. Even when studying alone, motivation changes depending on whether the students feel completely isolated in the process or connected to something outside themselves. This does not require social support in a literal sense all the time. It can be as small as reconnecting a subject to a human context, remembering that mathematics was developed by real people solving real field problems, or that literature is not just analysis but also expression of a human experience. It can also come from indirect connection, studying with the awareness that other students are struggling with the same material, or that what is being learned is part of a larger shared intellectual process. The absence of relatedness often makes studying feel like isolation under pressure rather than participation in something meaningful. So, in practical terms, what self-determination theory suggests is not a change of system, but a change of position inside the system until it changes. Students cannot fully control external evaluation, but they can partially control how much ownership they take in the learning process, autonomy, how they interpret progress, competence, and how connected the process feels to something beyond pure performance, relatedness. And even small shifts in these dimensions can gradually change how learning is experienced without requiring the system itself to change first, yet.